And you mentioned psychopharmacology. That began just about when you were
In
a
training.
student,
And
right?
student, right. Yes,
And
1950s.
the first really effective treatment for schizophrenia was Thorazine.
Thorazine,
correct?
stelazine, yes,
And how
followed.
did those influence the patient population? What change did you see in the patient
Well,
population?
because dosages weren't, I mean, the physicians weren't sure of how to regulate dosages and what their effects were going to be on people. We saw a range of changes. Sometimes it made the patients extremely drowsy and they slept a good part of the day, made them very unable to carry on some of the activities of daily living. And others responded extremely well and were able to process thoughts much easier and were able to be discharged. And then, of course, a whole new range of services were required at that time because once people started being discharged, we needed a lot of community support services for them. And we were very fortunate at Mohawk Valley because we had a very committed staff who were able to develop wonderful outpatient services, which still continue to this day.
Were there patients who left Old Main and then came back for outpatient services?
Yes. Oh, yes. Everybody, yes. And some of the people were readmitted. Some of the patients were readmitted because they had a very difficult time in the beginning adjusting to community life. So.
And how were discharge eligibilities determined? Can you describe
Well,
that process?
I can remember in Old Main where there was a long table in a room and doctors were around that table and a patient was brought in and sat. And pretty much it was decided by the physicians ahead of time and the patient really didn't get a chance to ask questions or be given a rationale, you know, or give a rationale for wanting discharge and what their plan was. So most of the time I just felt it was like a due and then that was over and patient remained in the hospital. But as time went on, the patients became much more vocal in their discharge planning and in their treatment process. And treatment started with the patient being admitted and involved in a treatment plan. And so when discharge came, if those goals were met, it was a completely different process. And there were not only doctors in the team that addressed treatment planning and discharge, but nurses, therapy aides, social workers, recreational therapists, occupational therapists as well.
And you've implied that in the early years of this process that you witnessed, there were no advocates for the patients. Is that correct?
Yes.
But advocacy became
A
more
big
common
part.
as you
Yes.
went along.
Yes.
You've implied that advocates were not involved in the early discharges that you witnessed, but they became important later, didn't they?
Yes. Advocacy was a big part of treatment planning and discharge in the discharge process as time went on. The Alliance for the Mentally Ill really encouraged facilities to ensure that not only patients, families were involved, but also any advocate from the Alliance be included in treatment planning. And that was a huge change for everybody on the treatment plan to get used to. But it proved to be one of the most and best effective ways of ensuring a treatment plan that would work for the patient while they were in the hospital as well as after.
We talked a little bit about psychopharmacology and antipsychotic medication that came into use in the late 50s and early 60s. What other sorts of treatments were you aware of or were you involved in at UTC?
Treatment modalities changed dramatically with the event of the psychotropic medications. And we went from performing lobotomies, using insulin shock therapy at the facility, which were horrendous treatments, but at the time they were the only kinds of things that were available, and mental health was really a new science, and really we did not have the advantages of some of the other medical diagnoses. So all of this was very new to everybody in the world, and of course restricted devices were used for people who were violent, and hence there were the dungeons or cells in the basement of Old Main Building. And from what I understand and from what I have seen, when we were able to go down to the basement, there were very dark, dank cells with tracks running along the walkways under Old Main, and food was delivered on little trolley cars to each of the cells, and the patients who were extremely violent were even chained in those cells. Not a very humane way of treating people, but that really was what was available then. And from what I've read, even in European countries, families that kept the mentally ill at home, and in our country too on farms, they were kept in barns and or chained, so that you know, it was a very inhumane way of treating, of keeping people who were violent, you know, not, you know, able to go out and do any more violence.
When you began having contact with Old Main patients in 1957,
Yes.
Were there still patients in the basement at that time?
No, there were no patients in the basement at that time. What took its place was violent wards. They called them the violent wards. We had one on north side, which was for male patients, and then the female violent ward was 24A on south side. And I remember patients being held in restraint with big canvas sheets and ropes tying them underneath the beds, and camisoles, which were half garments, half canvas garments, and they had no ability. Their hands and arms were all included, and they were also tied behind the patient's backs so that they were not able to punch or hit themselves or other people. Lobotomies, I remember in particular one male patient who had a beautiful voice and was trained at the Juilliard School of Music. And he came to us and was very violent at times. The family was approached to consent for a lobotomy, and I remember the reluctance on the family's part. But because the doctors really encouraged the family and felt that the patient would have a better quality of life, they did agree. And in the subsequent talent shows that that patient performed in, he no longer was able to learn new music nor exhibit any kinds of emotional content when he performed his music, his songs.
You just mentioned talent shows. Were those performed in the auditorium, the theater that was
in the Old Main Building? Yes, we had a theater there, a room. I believe it was on the second floor. It was a beautiful room, and they held dances there, and they had the talent shows there as well for the patients. And the patients looked forward to them, and of course all the staff attended and clapped, and it was a great way for the patients to have some recreation.
Going back just a little bit to therapy, you mentioned insulin therapy. What was the goal of insulin therapy?
Again, that was to help reduce the violence, as well as to increase maybe the thought processes to improve. I don't remember too much of the insulin therapy. I do remember the electric shock therapy that we performed at the hospital, and everybody had to be certified in that, and that electric shock therapy went on for several years. It was frowned upon by many psychiatrists in the field, but it was also felt that it was the last resort of treatment for certain people who did not respond to medications, who did not respond to any form of treatment modality, and so that was performed at our hospital only on certain patients, and I think we stopped that during the 1990s, late 1990s.
Was there a therapy called water therapy?
That was, yes, patients were submerged in cold water for that therapy. And again, that was not done frequently as far as I can remember.
And was there an explanation of the therapeutic benefit of
Again, to
submerging in
reduce,
water?
again, that was the water therapy was, again, a treatment modality to decrease the amount of violence that people would express. And if somebody was extremely violent at a time, they were taken into the shower room and water filled in the bathtub, and then that was supposed to be a way for them to cool down their emotions.
So it was thought that actually lowering their temperature was going to
Reduce the amount of violence,
Okay.
or, yes,
Okay.
they were expressed.
Was there still a Utica crib at Old Main when you were first there?
The Utica crib was something that was devised at Utica, and it was a crib that it was a very large piece of furniture, and it had bars on all sides, a padding on the bottom, and the top it opened up from the top, and that also had bars all along the top, and it was locked from the outside. That crib was used throughout the state of New York, and I believe that it was used at Marcy up until the late 1950s, maybe, early 1960s. I don't recall it being used at Mohawk Valley Psych Center.